Good morning, everyone. My name is José Baldívia, and I'm a Master in Public Administration candidate at Columbia University. Throughout the summit, we will recognize how Brazil stands as a reliable partner in advanced climate solutions, reflecting the hard work of the private sector, government, international organizations, civil society, in laying the ground for the future of global economy, and also COP30. Our program begins by grounding us in the realities shaping today's world. To guide us through these dynamics, reflect on Brazil's role, and suggest pathways forward, we now turn to our panel. I'm delighted to welcome Jason Bordoff, Founding Director of the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, Jack Hurd, Head of the Earth Systems Agenda of the World Economic Forum, Shari Friedman, Managing Director for Climate and Sustainability of Eurasia Group, Maria Netto, Executive Director of Instituto Clima e Sociedade, and Jorge Hargrave, Director at Maraé Investimentos, will be moderating this session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to open the 4th edition of the Brazil Climate Summit. I'm very happy to be so many familiar faces and some other new faces, which is also good, and of my friends and colleagues who have been building this together with me over the last years. It's been an incredible journey, hope to a long one. So there's no better way in this very volatile world. So there's no better way to start the day than thinking about the very easy topics of geopolitics and climate politics. But we're good. We're happy to have so many experts who are going to help us navigate through these easy topics. So Shari, as you work with the geopolitics and climate politics, I'll start with you. So what are the most significant trends that we need to be observing, and how are these trends shaping climate-related choices that economies have to make, and how should Brazil navigate this?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers, to everybody for having me again. So appreciate it. This is incredibly this is evolved into an incredibly well-run forum. So Eurasia Group, where I work, we are a geopolitical risk firm. So we help the world's largest multinational companies figure out what trends are going on, how to navigate them, and what's probably about to happen in the different scenarios that could fall through. So when I'm going to say these trends that I think are going to happen, it's what we tend to be talking to our clients a lot. It's what our clients are really interested in. But I will say, I'll be here throughout a lot of the day, so I'd be interested to hear if people have other things that are on the top of their mind that I'm not covering. I would be very interested to hear what your thoughts are as well. So I'm going to throw out a few of them. The first one, and I think nobody will be surprised, is weaponized trade. So what we're seeing is this incredibly dynamic, very shifting trade environment, largely instigated by the United States kind of shifting around its trade pieces. So you're seeing a lot of conversations around this tariff rate and that tariff rate, and we're going to do this for 3 months, and there's just a lot of consternation going on. But what's going on underneath all of that movement is there's shifting supply chains. And I think that that's really important, and it's important for Brazil because Brazil is also considering decoupling out of the United States. And when it starts to think about where it's moving toward, there's a lot of conversation about, Brazil either going US or China, but it's not quite like that. There's a much more robust dance card that Brazil is putting together. And one of the really important trade partners that it's building up is Europe and the European Union and the countries in there. And I think when you think about that, that means that Brazil is going to have to think a lot more about the policies that are going on in Europe, which I know is on top of mind for a lot of people, including the agriculture and the forestry sectors. The other one that I would say is these increased pressures that we're seeing on sustainable policies. And I think that's really relevant in Europe, but it's relevant elsewhere. You're seeing an increase in defense spending. You're seeing an increase in concerns about competitiveness, and that kind of ties into a lot of the trade issues. So, when you see this, I think Europe is a great example. You're seeing the influx of populism. They have a very robust environmental policy structure, And these different pieces are starting to make them readjust their policy structure. So far, not a retrenchment, but so far it's a readjustment, but it's a space to watch for sure. Then you also have this continuation of a reduction of technologies. So you have a price reduction, not reduction of technologies, a price reduction of clean technologies. And this isn't just technologies, but it's also really interesting financial instruments coming on. So what this means is that people can move faster, industries and companies can move faster in countries on decarbonization because you have these other options. You've got these interesting financial mechanisms for nature-based solutions. You have very cheap batteries. You've got very cheap solar and wind. And solar and wind is important even in Brazil with an incredibly green grid, because the grid is expanding rapidly, and you have to know how you're going to expand it in a place where hydro may not always be the answer because of changing climate. So what I would say is, where a few years ago I would have said that the overall movement on sustainability trends was pretty clearly going in one direction, now it feels like you've got these varying currents going on, and they're not, and they're pulling in different directions. I think, to take Luciana's mountain metaphor, you have like people all over the mountain. Some are adding some dirt, some are taking some dirt away. And so it's really complicated to be able to see where you're seeing the divots and where you're seeing the additional mounds going on. And that's what we're doing a lot of time tracking.
Thanks, Shari. Jason, I'll turn now to you. You've written a lot about the new geopolitics of energy, right? So how are these technological advancements that Shari was mentioning, how are they creating a new landscape of geopolitical competition, but also cooperation? And where do you see Brazil fitting in this new scenario?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the invitation to be here. And as you heard, I run the Center on Global Energy Policy. It's now the largest energy think tank in the country, started that 12 years ago. And I remember arriving at a great research university like Columbia and saying, we're going to hire a bunch of people who don't look exactly like all the other academics here, and we're going to try to build a center of excellence on energy geopolitics that measures its success by whether it's helping decision makers outside of academia understand the world better and make better decisions. And for some people, that was like a little different or confusing, but no one has been more supportive of what we've been doing than Tom for the entire duration of the time that I've been here, and the need to take a global perspective and take advantage of the extraordinary network of global centers. So I just want to congratulate you on your run leading the Rio Center, and thanks for the great partnership for so long. Look, I mean, for that whole time we've been doing this, again, I came out of the National Security Council, so the idea of building a center focused on energy and climate through the lens of foreign policy, national security, geopolitics. One of the first people I hired at the Center on Global Energy Policy is one of the leading experts in the world on sanctions. And it was confusing, like, I thought you were working on climate change. Why do we need to understand sanctions? I don't think anyone's confused anymore that, like, these are the same thing. And one of the biggest challenges we're going to have moving forward is going to be how to think about issues of economic security, national security, energy security, competition, rivalry, and this new era of fragmentation. I think it was unfortunate that we pulled back a lot of support for the through the Inflation Reduction Act for renewable energy. But whether you have those tax credits or not, there's still a growth trajectory for renewables unless the United States decides that it is an energy security risk to import any pieces of supply chains and components from China, because you can't think about a global energy transition or think about solar and EVs and batteries without recognizing the dominant position China has in those supply chains. I think the other thing to sort of acknowledge is it was sounded like a downer at these sorts of events for the last decade, because there was so much progress, so much excitement, so much advancement. If you went back 10 years ago and said, how much are the costs of wind and solar and batteries and EVs going to fall over the next decade, we've exceeded anyone's wildest expectations. The amount invested in clean energy globally last year was 2 times what was invested in fossil fuels. The vast majority of the investment in new power generation is zero carbon sources of energy. And over other than a pandemic and a global recession, oil use is going up, gas use is going up, coal use is going up, and emissions are going up. So this idea that like two things can both be true at the same time, and it is really important to not just get excited about the growth in clean energy, but take seriously the scale and magnitude of the global energy system and how daunting the challenge of transition is, not just clean energy addition, where we meet the growth in global energy demand. I just think we haven't had an honest conversation about that. Nevertheless, if you want to take seriously not just providing access to electricity to charge cell phones or turn light bulbs on, but have meaningful levels of economic growth in emerging and developing economies, the numbers are enormous. And then you layer on top of that this new world of, as I said, geopolitical competition and fragmentation. And then the history of energy is one of competition. It is one of energy's use as a weapon. It is deeply responsible in various ways for outcomes in World War I, World War II, the Suez Canal crisis, the Arab oil embargo. You go through the history of the 20th century, energy, particularly oil, is like a coercive tool of global foreign policy. The last couple of years, we've kind of been lulled into a sense of complacency because that largely hasn't been true. There's obviously exceptions and we can list them, but we've had relatively abundant energy supplies. We've had relative affordability of energy. We had a sort of 20, 30-year period of copacetic geopolitics and more economic integration and optimism about globalization and China's entry into the WTO. And after the Cold War, the US and Russia did a deal to take the uranium from Russian warheads and turn it into nuclear fuel for the US to import, without much concern that we were becoming dependent on Russia for our nuclear fuel. That world is over. And we're now moving to a world of increasing uses of coercive tools of economic statecraft to drive outcomes, much more concern about interdependencies created by all of that globalization. And I think energy is squarely in the crosshairs of the kind of new world of economic weaponization of various tools that we've just barely started to see. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and cutting off gas supply is a prominent example. China has started to restrict, some rare earth elements in a few ways, but it's just the tip of the iceberg for the potential energy weaponization, the return of energy weaponization. And I think on the one hand, if you're in a world where energy security is much more front and center, and you're not the largest oil and gas producer in the world, like the United States, we can come back to the US in a minute, what would you want to do? Say if you're in Europe, you'd want to be less dependent on global trade. You'd want to have more that is domestic, which means more electrification, more sources of domestic electricity generation, like renewables, maybe nuclear. For some parts of the world, that may mean coal. But then you have to think about the extent to which the risk of supply chain concentration is also an energy security risk. And I think that's just a topic we don't know how to think about yet. There's a lot of rhetoric. We don't want to go from dependence on the Middle East for oil to dependence on China for batteries. But what those risks actually are and how problematic they are and what we should do to de-risk them, because it's impossible to think about mining everything within your own borders. I think that's all an opportunity for Brazil, really, but also a challenge, because Brazil is going to get caught in the middle between this new era of great power competition and rivalry. Where does it align itself? It could be on the receiving end of some of those sources of coercion that I talked about, but it's a pretty clean economy. The world is still recognizing more and more, even the International Energy Agency, that the world needs oil supply and needs investment in oil. Brazil's a really important player in that regard. It has enormous opportunity if we want to diversify critical mineral supplies to play a role in that. So there's a lot of opportunity there, but also that sort of middle power emerging market risk, figuring out how to align oneself in this new era of rivalry and competition.
Thanks, Jason. Jack, I'll turn to you now. So how do you translate all of this to Brazil, to Brazilian companies, Brazilian stakeholders? How can they build competitive advantage out of this changing world, to get the segue from what Jason was saying?
Well, that's no small question, given what's been said already. So, but first of all, I do want to thank you, Jorge and Luciana, Marina, and Netto for the invitation to be here today. This is great. This is my third opportunity to come to the Brazil Climate Summit, and I enjoy it every year. So, a couple things that are on my mind when I think about this. One is that Brazil's in a relatively unique situation globally. So we know that approximately 60 to 65% of its emissions come from the land use sector. And that's relatively unique for a middle-income country. And that is largely because it has A, a lot of renewables, and B, it has a pretty robust agriculture sector. So it's in a relatively unique situation. Some countries have one of those, few countries have both of those. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for Brazil to take advantage of the situation and to utilize that renewable energy in the area of industry decarbonization or mobility. But the real opportunity, I think, for Brazil is on the agricultural side of things, and the linkage between agriculture and natural habitats, forests being the primary one. And so I just want to maybe say a few words about that and those opportunities. There's a lot of countries in the tropics, but also in the temperate zones and the boreal, where land use change will really drive emissions, and where land use opportunities are pretty strong. And I think that there is this emerging thinking that you can try to find the way to balance production and protection on the land use sector. With colleagues at Systemic a couple of years ago, we did a big report on the Cerrado that suggested that this production protection dynamic can yield about $72 billion worth of economic activity on an annual basis if you get this right. So there's ways to get this right, and I think I just want to mention 4 things that are part of Brazil's ability to get this right. One, and the role of the private sector in that. So one is on the conservation of forests, right? We're increasingly understanding the impact of deforestation on agricultural productivity. So we know we need to do a better job of managing the forest that is currently standing. Innovative finance instruments around the use of carbon credits or the emerging Tropical Forest Forever facility create opportunities for the private sector to invest in conservation of forests. The second one is on forest restoration. I think Brazil is really leading a global charge, and a number of people in the room here are actively engaged in efforts around restoration. And I think, under the auspices of the Brazil Restoration and Bioeconomy Finance Coalition and Capital for Climate and other people, there's a lot of really good models, business models being developed that's attracting real financial resources into this space on restoration. The third one is on the sustainable management of fiber. So, eventually the world has to find sources of fiber for paper, pulp, packaging, construction materials, bioplastics, and all these things that are emerging. And I think Brazil is in a really unique opportunity to capitalize on that increasing global demand, especially as the global demand shifts from temperate and boreal forests into the tropics. And so companies like BTG Pactual's Timberland Investment Group and Suzano and others are really showing different ways to integrate sustainable forest management and the restoration agenda. And then the last one, which is probably the most important, and I'll finish here, is on the intensification of agriculture. So Brazil has a significant amount of degraded land. So whether it's 100 million hectares or 40 million hectares or 12 million hectares, pick your number, there's a lot of degraded land in Brazil. And I think there's been a very strong demand incentive for deforestation and conversion-free agricultural products coming out of the European Union. There's conversations between China and Brazil on this. There will be conversations between the UK and Brazil on this. And I think that a lot of the private sector actors, whether they're consumer-facing companies that are global in nature or they are global commodity trading firms, they've all made commitments in this space around intensification. And so I think there's really good opportunities there. In all these 4 areas, public policy sets the framework, finance sort of drives decision-making, but ultimately private sector corporations execute on this. And I think there's a lot of good space here.
Thanks a lot, Jack. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Netto, so Jack mentioned financing as one of his last points. So if you can get this segue of, so from a financial perspective, how would you characterize the current state of Brazil's green finance landscape?
Okay, thank you. Nice to be here with all of you. A couple of things. I think Brazil has quite a sophisticated financial sector. Our economy relies much more on borrowing and lending and banking, but we, for example, in the green agenda, I think have had a very relevant role also on the capital markets. So I wanted to start a bit with that, because the fact that Brazilian government has started issuing sovereign green and sustainable bonds was a very important opportunity, not only to dedicate investments in important infrastructure in Brazil, aligned to climate and green, but because the resources are being used to the development bank, Brazilian Development Bank, to finance Fundo Clima. Also, on the private sector, the green debentures incentivize debentures that has a lot of the financing available, for example, for renewables, but also for sustainable infrastructure, amount to over $19 billion. So it's an important amount. But I think there are new innovative mechanisms that have been lately developed, partially by the government. I would like to talk about EcoInvest, which has been a very important instrument that Brazil designed recently, which provides for a kind of guarantee and blended that supports international investors to be able to actually invest in Brazil through financial sector. And that initially was designed to support investments in PPPs and large infrastructure, but more recently, and I think thanks to a lot of the connections and dialogues with private sector and some of us here, have been piloted as well for what Jack was mentioning, sustainable agriculture. The latest EcoInvest actually call for proposals managed to leverage about 30 billion reais, which is about $6 billion. So I think just wanted to give these figures, like the Brazilian bonds have been about 2.7 billion a year. We are talking about the debentures that have $19 billion. And just this call from EcoInvest was able to leverage about 30 billion reais. So we're talking about large numbers, and this is being able to push for the market. But I also wanted to mention the fact that, in addition to that, we do have quite a few, I think, innovative mechanisms that are not necessarily yet at this scale that we would love to be, but that are important. And so I wanted to highlight some. We are seeing, for instance, many asset managers and fund developers developing innovative mechanisms, trying, for example, to do with the off-taker, for example, guarantee some kind of development of local value chains, or having blended finance between resources from philanthropists, for example, with resources of private sector to do very innovative initiatives, particularly, for example, bioeconomy. And they are not large, but they are really very emblematic and could be scaled. And I wanted also to highlight other kind of innovations as well that are happening at the subnational level. We were talking here about the renewables and the energy and the minerals. One important part of it is also the royalties that come from those sectors. And in Brazil was interesting because one of the movements with the royalties was to create subnational sovereign funds, small funds. But the example of Espírito Santo, which is a subnational state in Brazil, was to take the money of the royalties of oil and gas and mining and put it in a sovereign fund, and more recently, take out of the sovereign fund the resources and create an asset manager fund that is now financing the decarbonization of the local industry. The beauty is that this state has some of the largest industries in Brazil, pulp and paper, mining, steel, and oil and gas. And the state also, talking about value chains, is a state that can have what we call the green corridors, the opportunity of not only investing in the value chain in terms of MSMEs and the decarbonization, but also in innovation in terms of technology. For instance, shipping, reducing emissions for shipping, and so on. So I think there is quite a lot of innovation as well, not yet at this scale. But if we can work more on that, that's also a great opportunity to develop further in Brazil.
Thanks, Maria Netto. So now turning to talk a little bit about challenges, right? So, and Shari, in some countries, not to say in all countries, the climate agenda became a very polarizing topic, right? I can't mention names, otherwise it's going to take a lot of time. But so, what is your view on how can Brazil build like a long-term consensus about this agenda and also de-risk investment and create this like a predictable policy environment to make climate a consensus topic as opposed to a polarizing topic?
Yeah. I mean, a predictable policy environment is like, it's the holy grail of all policy environments. It's what every company wants. And I would say that, there's really only one country that really has, one large economy that has a predictable policy environment, and that's China. And all the rest of us have this messy democratic thing that we've got to deal with that creates like kind of back and forth stuff that, that can be very complicated. That said, I think that there are things that create more durable policies that can withstand kind of flip-flopping of different regime changes. So I think the main thing that we look for is who holds the political power inside of a country, and making sure that you create incentives rather than disincentives for those places. And I want to, Jason had touched on the US Inflation Reduction Act. And I know that when I'm talking about policy durability, to bring that up probably seems odd because it just pretty much got largely dismantled under the new administration. But when you look at, I think it was a really well-structured policy, because what they did is they created incentives, financial incentives, to build up a clean supply chain, focusing on areas inside of Republican districts, right? And so I think if you were going to have any other situation, that strategy probably would have worked. We just have an unusual situation right now, but I don't think that you can say, oh, that whole strategy doesn't work. It was very smart. And I think it does have some durability in some sectors. I don't think it's a whole wash. When you look at batteries, there is still a lot of political support now on both sides of the aisle to build up the local battery chain, which I think is going to have a really big impact on the long-term ability for decarbonization in the country. So like you take that back over to Brazil, which I think is your main question. And I think the biggest threat and the biggest opportunity is, of course, on agriculture. And the farmers on deforested areas have a lot of political power. And so I think when you do this, you take what Jack said, I think it was really, really important. And what he was saying was that you've got a lot of opportunities. He sort of demarcated all the different opportunities you can build on, and the financial incentives that are coming in. I think what Jack was saying was you have all of these different international markets that are demanding decarbonized agricultural products. And so if you can build up the structures and the incentives that enable the farmers in Brazil to be able to tap into these markets to create within a very powerful structure inside of Brazil, a much more durable policy, because a command and control approach inside of a very powerful political area, constituency is not going to be durable through different policies. And I think you can take this inside of Brazil into a lot of different, there's a lot of opportunity there. You have a clean grid, so you've got a lot of industrial policy, a lot of industrial opportunities to bring in that sector for international trade that is trying to decarbonize supply chains. You also have biofuels, and Maria had noted the biofuel market growing on sustainable aviation fuel, on maritime. It's going to be a really big deal. Those are allies in this. So I think the main thing is finding where you can build it up. And I just want to say one other thing, which is I think that Brazil has been very clever in being able to figure out how you can create these incentives that don't rely on Brazil's fiscal budget. So the Tropical Forest Forever facility, for example, is a really good example of how you can start to get other money in. I think that the way that Brazil has structured its carbon market is also incredibly clever, because what it did is it put the cap on certain industries, and it allowed the agricultural industry to buy in. So again, you're creating an economic incentive for the agricultural industry to buy in and get carbon credits without having to actually use use Brazil's own fiscal resources to be able to pay them. So I feel like this is, sorry, I'll cut off, I know we're running out of time. I'll just leave it there.
Don't worry, thank you, Shari. Jason, coming back to critical minerals in this new era where critical minerals are the new oil, how can Brazil use critical minerals, its renewable energy, and green hydrogen potential to create a new form of geopolitical power?
Well, I guess first the premise of the question that critical minerals are the new oil, I think, is worth thinking hard about and kicking the tires on. There are very significant differences between the daily flow of energy, without which economies shut down, mobility grinds to a halt, and the input to finished products that would potentially raise the cost or create supply chain bottlenecks and delays in, buying new batteries to store energy. You're not. If the U.S. is concerned about dependence on China for refining and processing of critical minerals, and there are legitimate things to be concerned about, not just for energy, but inputs to heavy rare earths, with applications for sensitive magnets with military purposes. But we're not buying electricity from China. They can't turn the lights out or cut off oil in some of the ways that we saw shortages in the 1970s. And that, I think, is an important thing to recognize because it leads to a potentially different set of policy solutions for how you think about that. There's still, I think, and whether it's personal masks or personal protective gear for a pandemic or medical equipment or pharmaceuticals, diversification is pretty important, right? That when Winston Churchill famously said, security in oil lies in variety and variety alone, that still is as true today as when he said it, and it's true for things other than oil. So the idea that nearly all the world's graphite is mined in China, or many critical minerals are refined and processed there, whether it's for geopolitical reasons or natural disaster or something else, diversification is sort of smart. And I think you see that. You just saw the United States Development Finance Corporation sort of announce a multi-billion-dollar potential fund to think about making investments for U.S. firms to try to invest in mining operations in other countries. And there's huge opportunities throughout Africa and Latin America to diversify these supply chains, as well as maybe domestically. And I think that's a big opportunity for Brazil. You asked about green hydrogen, and I think there's it is both a necessary part of the toolkit for getting to net zero, and I think people are realizing now that there are a lot of obstacles as well, and there seems to be a lot of interest in making green hydrogen and a lot less interest in buying it because it's kind of expensive right now, and so I think, but even if there was, you sort of have to roll the clock forward in an oil market that's 100 million barrels a day, and deeply integrated into the global economy, and ask, a decade from now or 2 decades from now, how big is the market for green hydrogen? Who are the buyers? There are certain industrial firms in certain sectors. Even if Brazil is a major supplier of that product, it's just basically a way to store energy and ship it. Does geopolitical power come from that? It's just never going to be as critical an input to an economy of a country as oil is. I think if you want to ask the question about geopolitical power, the International Energy Agency just came out with a major study on how decline rates are accelerating for global oil supply. U.S. shale production may be close to plateauing. The idea that global oil demand is going to peak and fall off a cliff seems not to sort of be playing out if people thought that was true. And we'll probably see the IEA come out with different scenarios now, some that show oil demand flatlining, some that show it growing, but nowhere close to the kind of projections that one would see if we were on track for our climate goals. And the conversation now is about whether we're setting up for another super cycle, and by the end of this decade, we're short oil supply, which is going to mean there's going to be a lot of interest in investing in new projects. We can talk about whether that makes sense from a climate standpoint, but this is going to be the economic and geopolitical driver. And countries like Brazil are very high on the list of the places people are going to look, along with Canada and a few other places. So the geopolitical power that traditionally comes from energy, oil more than anything else, again, whether people are happy to hear this or not from a climate standpoint is not the point I'm making, but that's going to remain true for quite a while to come for a country like Brazil.
Very tough and realistic view, but good to ground us. Jack, you work on an international organization, right? So, with the whole geopolitical mess that is going on right now, what is the role of international organizations, and how to overcome the challenges to keep advancing the climate agenda, and how can Brazil help it?
It's tricky. So I work at the World Economic Forum, and we like to think that in periods of disruption and maybe not quite chaos, but uncertainty, it enhances the need for organizations like ours, where people can get together, have conversations, and work on things that are a little bit removed from the day-to-day political interactions. So I think there's maybe three big challenges that we see in this space: science, finance, and collaboration. I want to say a few words about each of those. On the science, so the science around climate and the science around nature, the biophysical science aspects of that are very clear and generally accepted as consensus knowledge. I think the economic implications of the climate and the nature crises is increasingly well understood. What's not really well understood, and maybe it's never going to be understood, is the political science aspect of this. And yet politics is informed more often than not by economics, by popular sentiment, and by sort of data. And in this case, I'm talking about data around the biophysical data. And so I feel like one of the big challenges that international organizations need to try to help overcome is, how do we continue to make the case that the climate and the nature issues are risks to be confronted, but they're also opportunities to be taken advantage of. And so we, on the risk side, we sort of know that the cost of action right now is high, but the cost of inaction is significantly higher. So we're going to either pay now or we're going to pay later. And so I think international organizations have a role to play in trying to frame these issues around the science, again, biophysical science, but also social science, that can really advance the thinking and the action on that. Number two, on finances. So there's two ways that I think to look at this. One is absolute amounts, and we often talk about the lack of public investment going from, let's call it, the global north into the global south, specifically around public investment. There is a significant amount of public investment out there. It's not all been used at the levels that it said it was going to be used at. So I think there's a continued role for international organizations in championing the need to make investments in the climate and in the nature space in the global south to help mobilize the transition, whether it's transition in energy, transition in mobility, transition in industry decarbonization, or transition in land use. At the same time, there's a role to play in the structuring of finance, right? We know that not one sector can finance everything that needs to be done, but we know that there's a role for public investment. We know there's a role for impact investment. We know there's a role for philanthropy. We know there's a role for catalytic capital, and we know there's a massive role for commercial capital. Structuring financial products, structuring financial services is something that I think international organizations can start to help financial institutions of various stripes think about. And the third one is what I think about the linkages between policy and practice. I work for the World Economic Forum. As mentioned, we only do three things. We can do thought leadership, we can do convenings and management of communities of practitioners, and we can do amplification work or strategic communications work. Taking ideas from one country, moving them around into places there they haven't been tested, there's really good opportunities for this. And I think in just closing, Brazil has a leadership role to play in all of these. When we think about the scientific credibility and the experiences of Brazil, when we think about the financial mechanisms, and I think Maria mentioned this in her statements earlier around the complexity and sophistication of financial mechanisms, and I think about the global leadership role of Brazil, specifically with the Global South, specifically with the tropical countries around something like the Tropical Forest Forever facility. I think there's a big role and an opportunity for Brazil to help and work with international organizations to overcome some of these challenges.
Thanks, Jack. But Netto, to continue the finance conversation, we're going to talk a lot about finance later today. But so there's still lots of risks and geopolitical risks and risk perceptions among countries. What Brazil has to do to increase, so enhance this risk perception about Brazil and reduce the cost of finance in Brazil, still on top of everything you've mentioned already?
So I think Brazil, as Jack was mentioning before, I mean, it has a huge comparative advantage, but to become competitive, the question is how this can be made at scale. We do have, as I mentioned before, quite a few things that are dynamically happening already, but not necessarily all of them are happening at the needed scale. Some of the barriers are barriers that we have on our financial regulations that don't have the flexibility, let's say, yet for example, scaling blended solutions. Some of the barriers are that we do have, as I mentioned, a very, let's say, strong banking market, but very little still in terms of risk-sharing mechanisms. To scale, for instance, the potential that Brazil could have on what Shari was mentioning in terms of value chains, reshaping value chains, and thinking about, for instance, X is looking and working with other partners as how Brazil could take the potential of excess renewables in the Northeast, make it a power shorting, so a space where we could attract investments, but also take advantage of this to become a green corridor for exports, requires policy, requires development of pipelines and so on. But from the finance point of view, there is also a lot of de-risking that is needed in terms of innovation. If we want to take advantage of becoming a major sustainable aviation fuel producer, restoring land, and Brazil has about 100 million hectares of land to be restored, and some of it can be used, for example, from Macaúba, as we are doing already with the private sector in Acelem. How can we have this kind of possibilities scaling? Requires guarantees, requires equity, and that kind of finance is not, let's say, in a scale available. So that is something we need to work with, and is still a barrier. A lot of the businesses we are talking that we could have in terms of innovation on nature-based have risks that are associated to these businesses, right? So in addition to technologies that indeed have a initial high capex and long payback, nature as well, if you are financing restoration, you are talking about financing something that will have 4, 5, or maybe even 6-year payback, with a banking system that is used to finance 6 months, 8 months kind of a payback period. This is a big barrier, and it's interesting because in Brazil, a lot of this innovation, that's why I was mentioned, is at the end being invested rather by funds than necessarily banking. But then still, if I'm an investor, a farmer, this is a big risk that I have to take a loan. And then on the off-taking, we also don't know exactly what will be the price, if the off-taking is going to be secured or standardized. It's not all about financing, because I think financing depends on also the business models and how we are precisely standardizing some of these practices. But for instance, if my forest burns between the moment I plant it and I get the payback, I don't have insurance. Or if I go to a bank and I want to get financed, even if I have a secured, let's say, off-taking contract, I don't have any guarantees, and I will have to present 100% collateral. So these kind of very specific problems that I'm just giving to be very concrete, the fact that we have a market that has, quite active players, but does not yet have a strong de-risking mechanism structures and blending that can be further facilitate, cannot yet be scalable. And I think that's an area we need to work much more on.
Thanks, Moderator. We only have 3 minutes to go, so I'll ask you to do like 30 seconds to close. So if you had to leave one advice for Brazilian companies, financial institutions, like on how to navigate this changing world, what would that be, Shari? In 30 seconds.
We did have a lightning round. We were talking about this before. I would say pay, for any, you're talking about for companies, for financial institutions, for everybody. I would say right now, can I have 2 things very quickly? I think that everybody has to do scenario analysis and not just go down on one path. Everybody has to track what you think is about to happen, the other alternatives, and the factors by which you think might switch you from one scenario into another. We spend a lot of time, but this is a super dynamic world, and if you're going to be looking at where you're going to be going, you have to be prepared to switch and understand what's going to make you switch. But within that, I would also say that international trade is something that's really something to keep an eye on, because carbon and other environmental factors are increasingly getting put in place there. So that is I think that's one of the major things to track.
Jack?
I think Brazil has the opportunity to lean into its strength, and its strength is in the agriculture and the forestry sector. The world is desperate for leadership in this space. Other tropical forest nations are desperate for leadership in this space, and there are financial returns to be had in this space. So I would love to see Brazil emphasize this at COP30. I'd love to see Brazilian companies get on board with that and show the world what it takes to do so. Because at the end of the day, we all have to eat.
Thanks, Jack. Jason, for 30 seconds.
I guess I would just, sorry?
For 30 seconds advice.
Advice. I guess I would just say if, next week at Climate Week or in any other setting, the conversations you're participating in sound like the ones we've been having as a climate community for the last several years, you're not having the right conversation. And so economic security, national security issues, in the energy world, security and affordability, like these are all going to be much more powerful drivers of how the energy system unfolds and how policy unfolds than the conversation we've been having in climate communities. And it's really important for the climate community to participate in those conversations and sort of meet the world on those terms.
Thanks, Jason. Maria Netto?
So to close, I think I will talk more about Brazil. It is extremely important that we have better platforms of private sector to discuss with public sector, but also have different parts of the private sector. We need to have investors, banking, at the table discussing with the project developers. Some of these platforms are things we are piloting with the Bioeconomy Restoration Coalition that some of us are part, the Nature Investment Lab. There are a number of these kind of platforms being developed, but it's extremely important, this kind of dialogue, because we need to get to the detail, but it's not a one silver bullet and an institution alone that will make these financial reforms that we need to scale the opportunities in Brazil.
I'd like to thank all the panelists. Please join me in a round of applause.